Welcome to Polaris Live. This is Sarwar Kashmeri welcoming our viewers from around the world to this series of programs on the United States and China and the world. This program is brought to you live in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association of New York. I'd like to remind our viewers that you can ask questions throughout the program using the comment button on the right-hand side of the screen. Time permitting, we will get to as many of them as we can. My guest today is Dr. Thomas Sherlock, Professor of Political Science at the U.S. Military Academy, West Point. Dr. Thomas Sherlock has supervised numerous large sample public opinion surveys in Russia and the Baltic states, as well as 24 focus group sessions in Moscow. He's the recipient of recent grants from the Minerva Institute and the Kennan Institute of the Wilson Center. His current research focuses on the evolution of elite and mass political culture in Russia. Tom's opinion pieces have appeared widely in numerous international media, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Valdai Discussion Club, which is in Russia. He's a prolific author and has served as a consultant for the Carnegie Council, the Russian Academy of Sciences. Please welcome Professor Thomas Sherlock.
Sarwar, thank you very much for inviting me to participate at this important event. And I look forward to discussing the context and background to the current tragic circumstances following Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Well, Tom, the pleasure and honor is entirely ours. You're one of the renowned scholars who understands Russia, the geopolitics, what's in the mind of Mr. Putin. So that having been said, thank you for coming on. What I'd like to do is ask you, the Russia-Ukraine war has dominated headlines for months. Analysts are divided on whether there is or is not strong opposition now to Russia's invasion of Ukraine within Russia itself. What's your opinion on that, Tom?
It's a central question, one that doesn't have an easy answer in terms of support for the current operation. And so I think it'll take some time before we have a better sense for how the war began, how much support there is for it at each stage in the conflict, because it's obviously ongoing with no clear end in sight at this particular point. I'll just say that so much of support or opposition to the war has to do with the perspective of members of the elites and also members of the mass publics toward the West. So this is a very, very important part of trying to understand how the war began and whether support for the war will continue. I've been going to doing field work in Russia for around 20 plus years, and the changes in the attitudes and values of the population toward the West have changed significantly over time, and provides the background. These changes provide the background for the whole question of support or opposition to the war today. We can talk a little bit more about the arc of those changing opinions toward the West over time, with perhaps other questions, but to go more immediately to whether there is support for the war today, I would say a couple of things. At least up to this point, the propaganda of the Kremlin that is justifying the war has worked for large segments of the population, both elite and mass publics. This propaganda of an anti-Western perspective, of course, has been in play for quite some time over the last building over the past couple of decades of Putin's rule. And so this ground has been prepared. This Western ground has been prepared with some fits and starts, but still an anti-Western perspective at some level of intensity has been going on for some time. So the ground has been prepared. I think also with the start of any military operation, you oftentimes see rally effects on the part of the population in supporting the government. And so I think what you see today are, and there's a third factor, of course, is the repression of horizontal communication in society. The costs of opposing the war are astronomically high, all right? These repressive actions could become much worse. And so people are very aware of the costs of expressing their true opinions. So there's a lot of preference falsification going on. And this is one reason why we don't have a really good sense of how many people oppose or support the war.
Let me interrupt, Tom,
please.
For a second, if I may, because there's a related issue that just comes to my mind that I wanted to interject, which is, American experts and media seem convinced that President Putin's policy is ultimately driven by his real determination to restore the glory of the Soviet Union. And there's some controversy on that. Do you buy that?
Well, in terms of restoring the Soviet Union, I think Putin's views probably changed over time. I don't think we can really put him on the couch and get a sense for what his true motives are. But I think there are some indications that Putin, like much of the elite, the political elite in Russia, and we of course have to unpack that concept as today the party of war, the party of peace, but over time also different groups within the elite, those who come from the military or the security services, those who are involved in globalization and more Western aligned pursuits and so on and so forth, those in the scientific and educational community. But to go back to your point, I would say the surveys that I have seen over time consistently demonstrate that most Russians are not interested in restoring the Soviet Union. Now, Putin, of course, may very much want to have that outcome. But I would say it's probably more nuanced than that. First, I think his views have changed over time. And even today, I think he understands perhaps better than most the costs of an authentic empire. That is, where you actually control populations. I think his invasion of Ukraine was based upon a profound miscalculation that he could quickly topple the government in Kyiv and install a pro-Russian government, similar to ones that have appeared in the past. But to actually taking over the entire country, that I think we would have to have more evidence for that perspective. He probably very much, at least at this point, wants to take over the Donbass and perhaps incorporate it into Russia proper and so on and so forth. But in terms of a full-blown imperialist agenda that is reconstructing the Soviet Union as it existed or something close to it, there really isn't sufficient evidence for that. Although there are probably significant numbers within the elite who, particularly in the security services, who would like that particular outcome. But Putin probably is aware of the costs of empire.
Which is interesting that you say that, because sometimes the media, the impression one gets is that he's kind of losing touch with reality, that, the stuff that he's doing, no sane person would do. And I'm, reminded many years ago, I had lunch with Ronald Reagan, Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger, when Mr. Putin had just assumed the presidency. And I asked him what he thought of Putin, and I've never forgotten, Tom, what he said. He said, never ever forget that Putin has received every award the KGB can give out. And it just strikes me that we should not underestimate his intellectual capabilities and try to kind of defocus them. And so, what is your opinion? You think he's all there? You think that it would be really bad to underestimate him?
Yeah, I think, again, a political scientist would say the tragedy today in Ukraine was perhaps overdetermined. In other words, there were many factors pushing toward this outcome of invasion. The people who say that Putin had perhaps become irrational due to self-isolation and a very small coterie of hardliners advising him and so on and so forth, I would say there's little doubt that that has played a role. I think also, though, a rational person could look out into the international environment in 2021 and say that conditions, if you want to roll the dice, conditions might favor a successful operation against Ukraine, similar to the one that unfolded in late February. That is, a strike against the capital of a neighboring country that you wanted to engage in your own form of regime change. The West looked weak in many, many different ways. Putin, I think, was strengthened his perspective by the growing association with China and so on and so forth. And so he demonstrated the capacity to gamble, but from his perspective, there was probably a strong element of rational calculation. But it was clearly a gross miscalculation. And that is another thing that will preoccupy analysts for some time. How could the security services of Russia miscalculate the state and nation building that had taken place in Ukraine to the point that you would have such resistance to an invasion as has taken place?
And of course, you're associated with perhaps the foremost military academy in the world, West Point. Were you personally surprised at the lack of how shall I say, skill demonstrated by the Russian military? Because at least I was under the impression that Mr. Putin, after the invasion of Georgia or taking over of that and so on, had redone the military, that locked out the weaknesses and so on. But were you personally surprised at how they behaved?
Yeah, I myself do not do intensive research into the capacity of the Russian military. I think, like many people, I was surprised at the audacity of the strike on Kiev, all right?
Right.
And also the failure of so much of the military, but most importantly, the reaction of the Ukrainian people. There are many ways to react to an incursion. I mean, you can either support it, you can collaborate, you can oppose it, or you can stay neutral.
Right.
And we still need, I think, a little bit more granular detail on the perspective of Ukrainians toward the invasion. But it appears that resistance was and remains significant and extremely important factor in the failure of Russian arms on the ground.
Yes. And I also wanted to ask you a related question as a political scientist that you are, which is the West is unanimous in its criticism of what Mr. Putin has done and almost the murderous way in which this war is conducted. But a larger part of the world has refused to join the West in condemning Russia. and that includes stalwarts who one would think would be more on the side of the West, and especially the United States, for instance, India and South Africa, which have tried to become democracies and are, in fact, practice. Any thoughts as a political scientist on why this has happened, that more countries are not supporting the West than are supporting the West?
Yeah, I think it's self-interest and values. I think it's a combination of factors that you'd have to look at each country individually to see how they evaluate how the war plays with their own interests and values. And China obviously is looking very closely for lessons for the invasion, but outside of China, you have not simply the ambivalence or the neutrality of places like South Africa, India, and so on and so forth, but fissures in the Western Bloc as well seem to be growing. How significant they become over time is another question, but you have, let's say, the parts of NATO in the eastern part of the bloc, obviously the ones that suffered the most under the empire and under the czars and commissars, they are most committed to opposing Russia at this point. But there seems to be growing ambivalence on the part of other players within NATO. And so when Putin looks out onto the international landscape, one of the factors that will help determine whether he maintains his resolve in fighting this war against Ukraine will be how he evaluates the prospective change in global opinion toward the war.
Right. I'd like to tangent back to what you just said a moment ago about China. I know that you've spent some time looking at the Russia-China relationship. Do you notice, do you sense any change in that comradely, brother to brother, no space between us? Do you notice from your vantage point any change in that?
So a little bit of background. I have done focus groups in Russia for some time among the general population, as well as students at universities in Moscow. I have also, with John Gregory, done focus groups at universities in Beijing. And basically, the question that animated the focus groups, or the central question, was how the students or general participants viewed the concept of a great power. In other words, what were the component parts of great powerness, if you will, all right? And also, how did the participants view other great powers, such as Russia and the United States, if we're talking about China, and in Russia, how the participants viewed the United States and China either as competitors or as partners in this enterprise of great power, competition, and cooperation.
Right.
And so I would say the major takeaways for the Russian participants, and now I'm talking about future elites in Russia, basically university undergraduates and graduates at top universities in Moscow. And so I've tracked them for some time. And basically what you see is a general hostility toward the regime. All right. They're, young, educated, highly oriented toward the West. Once and all, they understand the problems of the West, but they also, generally speaking, have a keen understanding and appreciation for Western democracy, particularly in comparison to their own political system. And so I think one of the tragedies of the current operation and war against Ukraine is that this group is becoming even more marginalized. That is, people who are closer to the West. We talked earlier about this very, very fungible identity that Russia has been trying to acquire, pro-West, pro-East, or something in between. And I think this group is the strongest that is pro-Western, but of course is being marginalized significantly. Their parents, who oftentimes share their perspectives, have left oftentimes with them the country entirely, weakening a source of opposition, to go back to that earlier question, source of opposition to Putin, because they have fled the country. Many have simply been cowed into silence because of the potential costs of protest, and so on and so forth. So there is a group of individuals who can play an important role in resisting the regime in some way, shape, or form. And the chances that they'll emerge in the future are good, but the question is, how strong are their numbers? To go quickly to their Chinese counterparts, that is, students in China. And to the extent that these views can reflect those of current elites, that is the key question. But the views in China among key students are that they see very, very little interest in Russia as a partner in supporting China's rise as a great power. They had a very modest assessment of Russia as a power, period. And the way they defined powerness or great powerness was not simply in terms of kinetic capacities, that is, military capacities, but primarily in terms of soft power. And they saw Russia as being very weak in terms of soft power, and therefore not a very attractive partner, whereas they saw the United States as a much more interesting, powerful actor in terms of the sinews of power, soft power in particular culture. All right. This doesn't mean they wanted to align with the United States. They saw Western democracy as chaotic and self-defeating in many ways, but still they saw the United States as something to aspire to in terms of how their power is defined and how it's manifest globally.
Which also I think would account, right, Tom, reflected in the number of Chinese students who come to America.
Yeah, but you know what I found interesting, and to go back to the earlier point about support or opposition to Putin, in terms of support, the key question is, how thick or thin is that support? Some people may just be dissembling when they say they support the war. I think other people, but there are also gradations of support. It can be authentic, but very thin and more readily reversible. And so I would say one of the interesting things about almost all of the Chinese students we interviewed in Beijing had either been to the West, had either anticipated going to the West, or knew someone who had been to a Western educational institution.
Wow.
Yet they still saw the value of American power in cultural terms, economic terms, and also global political terms. But they really did not have a strong attraction to American liberal values or Western liberal values. And again, to go back to the question, how thick or thin is this rejection of Western liberal values? Are they simply aping the line of the regime in Beijing, or do they actually incorporate the view that they are the authentic democracy and they are the authentic rising power?
Wow. I want to, as we start looking at the last 10 minutes or so, I want to tangent back to Ukraine, Tom, because and what I'd like to ask you is, how do you see this war ending for Russia? What is the end state, in your opinion, of this war. And then, if you don't mind, I'll throw in another piece to that, which is, and what role might the U.S. potentially play in it?
It would be foolish to uh, predict how the war will end, because there are so many variables that you'd have to look at. If you look at it from, let's say, the Russian perspective, I think Putin now, we can only assume, is highly invested in reputational concerns as to how it would look if he decided to disengage, if he decided to cut a deal with Ukraine that could be perceived as weakness. So it's impossible to say what would be an acceptable deal to him, but we can assume that he is narrowing his perspective by obviously concentrating on the Donbass. All right, and so will that be enough? If and when those regions are conquered, will that be enough for him to say, we've accomplished our initial objectives, all right, and so on and so forth, and then try to restore a semblance of domestic and also international stability in some form? So that is a key question. The other key question is the resiliency and resolve of the Ukrainians. If they continue this heroic struggle with the success on balance that they've achieved so far, and that is inflicting very high casualties on an invader who is incrementally taking more and more territory from them, that is something to consider. I think if you could see a scenario in which Putin was willing to trade peace for land, let's say the Donbass becomes part, and Crimea is recognized as part of either Russia's sphere of influence or part of Russia proper. The key question is how well can and how willing would be President Zelensky to negotiate on those terms. Even if he were willing to trade land for peace, his ability to deliver such an agreement, I think, would be extremely difficult in the present political climate in Ukraine today.
Right.
It would be, I think, if you recall the political difficulties that Zelensky had before the war began, he has been a superb wartime leader. But negotiation would take the war into a different plane, onto a different plane, and different political skills would be needed. Different levels of political support would be needed to deliver some sort of agreement with Russia, because emotions are so high. And also, until fairly recently, there was a perspective that the battle could be won in favor of Ukraine.
Right.
And I think there are still, presumably, many in Ukraine and in the West who believe that that outcome is still possible. So these are so many moving parts, so many known unknowns that would have to be grappled with to answer the question, how does the war end?
But let me push a little bit and dive a little deeper into what I just asked you. There is no question about the bravery and the skill, the leadership of the Ukrainian president and his people. But it seems to me the fact of the matter is that that Russia is very slowly grinding down and obliterating large parts of major Ukrainian cities. It's becoming an old siege type war where the the Russian artillery is just banging away at the Ukrainians, right? And so I come back to this question of what role might the U.S. play in this, because can the U.S. really keep supplying the billions and billions and billions of dollars, watching Ukrainians get killed by the hundreds, if not thousands, and without at some point doing what Dr. Kissinger, I think, said the other day is, listen, we need to get some influence going here to point out to Ukraine that you need to trade some territory. I mean, I'm just trying to figure out how the U.S., what role can and should the U.S. play besides giving all the aid possible to the Ukrainians. And I realize it's a difficult question, a lot of moving parts, but I just wanted you to blue sky that for us, if you would, please.
So, in my opinion, I think among the many important things that the United States can do, I think is to convince Putin that he himself must negotiate in good faith with Ukraine and place authentic proposals on the table. That has not happened to this point. And I would say to encourage Putin to do this, you always run the risk of escalation, brinkmanship, and solipsistic outcomes if you're playing a very, very aggressive game against an opponent. But I think in this case, the stronger the West is and the more cohesive a coalition against the invasion is, the better chance that we will have to get Putin to the negotiating table. And so how would you do that? I think one way to keep a coalition together, particularly those countries in Latin America, South Africa, and India, is basically not to frame this necessarily or not emphasize this as a struggle between democracy and autocracy, because that narrative immediately turns off a number of countries, all right? Particularly China, all right? It clearly does not want to be placed into this camp. I think a more logical and effective strategy would be to say that, Russia is breaking the basic norms of the international order. That is, that borders need to be respected, such a basic component of the existing international order. And this is something that almost all countries can agree with and should probably be one of the most important components of our narrative as to why Russia's invasion should be resisted. And so the stronger the coalition, I think the greater incentive that Russia will have to come to the negotiating table and be willing to engage in authentic negotiation.
Well, as we are running out of time, but I just wanted to clarify one point. So perhaps the contribution you're thinking the U.S. Could make is to recalibrate or redo the reason why it's so important for the West to support this war, but change it from a democracy versus autocracy to basic human rights and to norms that we've all lived in since the Second World War. Is that kind of what you're thinking?
Well, I think obviously supporting Ukraine, which has a very strong liberal democratic identity,
yes,
increasingly so. So that can never be downplayed or ignored in justifying supporting Ukraine's efforts on the battlefield. But in terms of the larger international coalition, I think it's probably best not to draw in such stark terms this as a fight between democracy and autocracy. And but I think we have more than enough reasons to continue to support Ukraine to the extent we have and beyond the extent we have. So I think this is really a crucial battle for not just Ukrainian identity and survival, but also for the West, quite frankly.
Dr. Sherlock, we could go on for a long time. You're a
We could.
fount of, you make things clarity, but I want to thank you so very much for taking the time to be on Polaris Live.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for the opportunity.
Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. And thank you very much for all of you who are viewing this program, for joining us. I hope you will be with us again for the next episode of Polaris Live, when we have forthright discussions on China, America, and the world in the broader context. Until then, thank you for viewing, and bye-bye.